144 BC, the rise of Liu Pengli, ancient China's shadow of terror in the vast expanse of ancient China, during the illustrious yet turbulent era of the Western Han Dynasty. A figure emerged whose name would echo through the annals of history not for valor or wisdom, but for unbridled cruelty and a thirst for blood that defied the norms of his time. This was Liu Pengli, the Prince of Jidong, a man whose life intertwined with the imperial court, yet whose actions plunged him into the darkest recesses of human depravity. Born into royalty as the nephew of Emperor Jing, Liu Pengli's story begins in an age where the Han Empire was consolidating its power after the chaos of the Qin dynasty's fall and the subsequent wars that birthed the Han rule. The year 144 BC marks the pivotal moment when Liu Pengli ascended to his princely throne, inheriting the fiefdom of Jidong upon his father's death. But this ascension was no mere transfer of power. It was the unleashing of a predator upon an unsuspecting populace. To understand Liu Pengli, one must first delve into the socio-political landscape of the Han dynasty. Founded by Liu Bang in 202 BC, the Han era represented a golden age of Chinese civilization, characterized by advancements in agriculture, the expansion of the Silk Road, and the establishment of Confucianism as the state ideology. Emperor Jing, who reigned from 157 BC to 141 BC, was known for his efforts to stabilize the empire, reducing taxes and curbing the power of local princes to prevent rebellions. Yet irony abounds, for it was within this framework of imperial control that Liu Pengli, a member of the extended Liu family, found the autonomy to indulge his sadistic impulses. Jidong, located in what is now modern-day Hebei province, was a prosperous region, dotted with fertile farmlands, bustling markets, and villages where peasants toiled under the watchful eyes of local officials. The prince's palace stood as a symbol of authority, its grand halls echoing with the sounds of courtly intrigue, but behind those walls lurked a mind twisted by arrogance and a disregard for human life. Liu Pengli was not a child when he began his reign of terror. Historical records, primarily from the Han Shu Book of Han, compiled by Ban Gu in the 1st century AD, describe him as being around 29 years old in 144 BC. This places his birth sometime around 173 BC, during the reign of Emperor Wen, his uncle's predecessor. As a young noble, Liu Pengli would have been educated in the classics, trained in archery and horsemanship, and groomed for a life of privilege. Yet, something within him deviated from the Confucian ideals of benevolence and righteousness. The Han Shu portrays him as arrogant and cruel, a man who viewed his subjects not as people to govern justly, but as playthings for his amusement. His crimes were not born of necessity or political ambition. They were acts of pure sport, a chilling precursor to the modern concept of serial killing, where the motive is thrill rather than gain. The narration of Liu Pengli's atrocities begins with the subtle erosion of order in Jidong. At first, whispers circulated among the villagers, strange disappearances, unexplained thefts, and bodies found mutilated in the dead of night. Liu Pengli assembled a band of followers, numbering between 20 to 30 individuals, comprising slaves, young delinquents, and fugitives who had sought refuge in his domain. These men, bound by fear or loyalty to their prince, became his instruments of terror. Under the cover of darkness, they would sally forth from the palace, armed with swords, bows, and an unquenchable desire for violence. Their raids targeted isolated homes, travelers on lonely roads, and even entire hamlets where resistance was minimal. The prince himself led these excursions, reveling in the chaos he wrought. Imagine the scene, the moon casting elongated shadows over the thatched roofs of a quiet village, the air thick with the scent of earth and cooking fires long extinguished. Suddenly the silence shatters with the thunder of hooves and the clash of metal. Liu Pengli, clad in dark robes to blend with the night, directs his men with a cold precision. A family awakens to the horror of intruders bursting through their door. The father, perhaps a simple farmer, grabs a hoe in defense, only to be cut down swiftly. The mother screams as her children are dragged away, their fates sealed in the prince's whims. Belongings are looted not out of need. Liu Pengli was wealthy beyond measure, but to add an element of conquest to the killings. The Han Shu records that these murders were committed for sport, a phrase that chills the blood even across millennia. No grudge motivated him, no rivalry spurred his blade. It was the act itself, the power over life and death, that fueled his madness. As the years progressed from 144 BC onward, the body count mounted. Historical accounts confirm over 100 victims, though scholars speculate the true number could be far higher, given the era's incomplete records and the fear that silenced many reports. Liu Pengli's methods evolved, becoming more brazen. He would sometimes disguise his raids as hunts, claiming to pursue wild beasts, only to turn his arrows on human prey. In one documented instance, a group of merchants traveling through Jidong were ambushed, their caravan stripped, bodies left as warnings to others. The prince's followers, emboldened by his protection, committed atrocities that included torture, dismemberment, and acts of unspeakable violation. The terror gripped the region like a vice, with families barricading their homes at dusk, whispering prayers to ancestors for deliverance. Yet in the rigid hierarchy of Han society, challenging a prince was tantamount to suicide. Local officials, aware of the horrors, turned a blind eye, fearing retribution from the Imperial court. Liu Pengli's status as nephew to the late Emperor Jing and cousin to the reigning Emperor Wu, who ascended in 141 BC, afforded him a shield of impunity. Emperor Wu focused on expanding the empire against the Xiongnu nomads and implementing economic reforms, had little time for provincial disturbances. Messengers from Jidong who dared complain were dismissed or silenced. The prince's arrogance grew. He began to flaunt his power openly, hosting lavish banquets where tales of his adventures were recounted with laughter among his cronies. To fully grasp the psychological underpinnings of Liu Pengli's behavior, one must consider the cultural context. In ancient China, the mandate of heaven justified imperial rule, but princes like Liu were semi-autonomous, their fiefdoms microcosms of the empire. Confucianism emphasized filial piety and moral governance, yet the allure of absolute power corrupted many. Liu Pengli embodies the archetype of the tyrannical ruler, akin to figures in later histories like the infamous King Zhou of Shang, whose cruelty led to his dynasty's downfall. Modern criminologists might diagnose him with psychopathy, a lack of empathy, thrill-seeking, and manipulative charm. His youth at the onset, merely in his late 20s, highlights how early such traits can manifest, unchecked by societal constraints. 130 BC. The deepening shadows escalation of terror in Jidong. By the year 130 BC, the once vibrant region of Jidong had transformed into a land shrouded in perpetual fear, where the arrival of nightfall brought not rest but dread. Liu Pengli, now in his early 40s, had ruled as prince for nearly 15 years, and what began as sporadic nocturnal raids had evolved into a systematic campaign of predation that gripped every village, hamlet, and roadside inn within his domain. The fertile plains along the ancient courses of the Yellow River tributaries, once teeming with rice paddies and bustling trade routes connecting to the imperial capital at Chang'an, now echoed with the muffled sobs of widows and orphans. Families huddled together in their modest earthen homes, doors barred with heavy wooden beams, windows shuttered tight against the moonlight that might betray their presence to the prince's roaming bands. Liu Pengli's palace in the heart of Jidong's administrative center, likely near modern-day areas in Shandong or Hebei provinces, stood as a stark contrast to the suffering outside its walls. Lavish courtyards adorned with carved pillars depicting dragons and phoenixes, gardens filled with exotic plants imported from distant southern kingdoms, and halls where musicians played soft melodies on silk-stringed instruments masked the grim reality. Within those opulent chambers, the prince entertained his inner circle of loyal retainers, recounting tales of recent excursions with a detached amusement that chilled even his most hardened followers. He had grown bolder, no longer content with random strikes, Now he selected targets with calculated cruelty, sometimes sending spies ahead to identify prosperous households or isolated travelers carrying goods worth seizing. The composition of his gang had also changed over the years. The original band of 20 to 30 slaves and fugitives had swelled at times, drawing in disaffected youths from noble families fallen on hard times, deserters from imperial garrisons, and criminals who found sanctuary under the prince's protection. These men, bound by complicity in shared atrocities, formed a tight-knit brotherhood of evil. Liu Pengli rewarded them generously: gold, fine silks, concubines from captured households, ensuring their silence and loyalty. Yet he ruled them with an iron hand. Any hint of disloyalty or hesitation during a raid met swift punishment, often death by strangulation or beheading in the palace dungeons. In this way he maintained absolute control, turning his followers into extensions of his own will. One particularly harrowing pattern that emerged in this period involved the targeting of entire families. Liu Pengli seemed to derive a perverse satisfaction from extinguishing bloodlines, as if erasing the future of those he deemed beneath him. In the autumn of 132 BC, for instance, a prosperous merchant family in a village near the eastern borders of Jidong fell victim. The father, a trader who dealt in salt and iron, commodities tightly regulated by the imperial government, had recently returned from a successful journey to Luoyang. His home, larger than most with tiled roofs and a small courtyard, drew the prince's attention. Under the cover of a moonless night, Liu Pengli led a group of 15 men straight to the compound. They scaled the walls silently, killed the gatekeeper with a single thrust, and poured into the sleeping quarters. The merchant awoke to the sound of his wife's screams. He fought valiantly with a ceremonial sword kept for display, wounding 2 attackers before being overwhelmed. His 3 sons, teenagers training in Confucian classics, were cut down as they rushed to defend their parents. The youngest daughter, barely 10, was spared momentarily, only to witness the desecration of her family before meeting the same fate. The raiders looted chests of coin, bolts of silk, and precious jade ornaments, but the true prize for Liu Pengli was the thrill of total domination. Such incidents multiplied. Villages began to empty as survivors fled to neighboring principalities, seeking refuge under more benevolent rulers. Abandoned farms overgrown with weeds dotted the landscape, their fields untended, irrigation channels clogged. Local officials, appointed by the prince himself, filed no reports. Many were complicit, receiving shares of the plunder or fearing for their own lives if they spoke out. Messengers dispatched to Chang'an with pleas for imperial intervention were intercepted or persuaded to alter their messages. The fear was so pervasive that travelers avoided Jidong roads entirely, opting for longer, more arduous routes through rugged hills, where bandits posed lesser threats than a royal murderer. Liu Pengli's psychology, as glimpsed through the sparse but damning records of Sima Qian and the Shijai, records of the grand historian, reveals a man utterly devoid of remorse. He viewed his subjects as mere objects in a grand game, their lives expendable for his entertainment. Unlike later tyrants who killed for political consolidation or paranoia, Liu Pengli's motive remained purely hedonistic: the rush of power over life, the adrenaline of the hunt, the satisfaction of watching terror spread like ripples in a pond. At banquets he would boast of narrow escapes, of victims' final pleas, laughing as if recounting a successful hunt for deer or boar. His retainers, forced to join in the mirth, masked their unease, knowing that tomorrow they might become expendable if they displeased him. As the body count climbed toward and beyond the documented 100, the psychological toll on the populace deepened. Children were taught never to wander far from home after dusk. Elders recounted tales of the night demons led by the prince to instill obedience. Superstitions flourished. Some believed Liu Pengli possessed dark arts, that his eyes glowed in the dark, or that he could summon shadows to do his bidding. Temples saw increased offerings to ancestors and local deities, prayers rising like incense smoke for protection from the royal scourge. Yet amid this darkness, seeds of resistance began to sprout. In one village, a blacksmith whose brother had been slain started forging hidden weapons, teaching young men basic combat in secret clearings. In another, a scholar who had studied under wandering Confucian teachers wrote anonymous petitions, smuggling them to sympathetic officials in adjacent kingdoms. Most crucially, a young man named Zhang, the son of a victim from an earlier raid, vowed vengeance. Having witnessed his father's murder as a boy, Zhang had grown into a determined adult, biding his time, gathering information on the prince's movements, and seeking allies who shared his outrage. By 128 BC, the terror had reached such intensity that even whispers reached the imperial court. Emperor Wu, Liu Pengli's cousin and now firmly established on the throne after his father's death, received vague reports of unrest in Jidong. Focused on northern campaigns against the Xiongnu and internal reforms, he dismissed them initially as provincial squabbles. But the persistence of rumors, coupled with declining tax revenues from the fearful region, began to draw attention. Court officials murmured about the need for investigation, though none dared name the prince directly for fear of imperial displeasure. Liu Pengli, sensing no immediate threat, continued his depredations with increasing frequency. His raids now sometimes occurred in daylight, disguised as inspections or hunts, where he would single out individuals for summary execution on fabricated charges. The line between prince and predator blurred completely. Jidong had become his personal killing ground. As this chapter of Escalation draws toward its close around 125 BC, the prince stands at the zenith of his unchecked power, his palace a fortress of indulgence amid a landscape of suffering. Yet the gathering storm, embodied in the quiet resolve of victims' kin and the slow awakening of imperial scrutiny, looms on the horizon. The son who swore justice, the officials who begin to listen, the emperor who cannot ignore forever, these forces inch closer, preparing the ground for confrontation. The night raids continue, but the dawn of accountability stirs faintly in the east. 125 BC. The gathering storm cracks in the prince's impunity. By 125 BC, the reign of terror orchestrated by Liu Pengli had stretched across nearly 2 decades, carving deep scars into the social fabric of Jidong. What had once been whispered rumors in remote villages had grown into a chorus of anguish that could no longer be entirely suppressed. The fertile fields still produced grain, the rivers still flowed, but an invisible pall hung over the land. Market days in the larger towns became subdued affairs. Merchants spoke in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders, while peasants hurried home before the sun dipped below the horizon. The very rhythm of daily life had been altered by the knowledge that any night could bring the sound of hooves and the glint of steel. Liu Pengli, now approaching his late 40s, showed no signs of tiring. If anything, the passage of time had sharpened his appetite. The early raids, impulsive, almost playful in their cruelty, had given way to something colder, more methodical. He began keeping rough tallies, not on paper, for even he understood the danger of written records, but in private conversations with his most trusted lieutenants. They spoke of scores, the way hunters might speak of game taken in a season. One retainer later testified, under duress, that the prince once remarked with satisfaction that they had passed the mountain of 100 some years earlier and were now climbing toward a second peak. Whether the number was exact or symbolic mattered little. The scale of death was undeniable. The prince had also refined his techniques. Night raids remained his preference, but he now employed scouts, young men posing as itinerant laborers or Buddhist pilgrims, to map vulnerable households weeks in advance. They noted the layout of compounds, the number of able-bodied men, the presence of watchdogs, the habits of the family. Liu Pengli would then choose his targets with the care of a general planning a campaign. Some nights the band struck swiftly and vanished, other nights they lingered, prolonging the terror for their own amusement. In several documented cases, survivors described the prince standing apart from the slaughter, watching silently, occasionally issuing quiet commands, "Leave that one breathing a little longer," or "Make her watch." These details, preserved in later accusations, reveal a level of sadistic control that went beyond mere killing. One of the most infamous episodes from this period occurred in the spring of 124 BC, near a small market town on the western edge of Jidong. A respected local official named Wei, who had served faithfully for many years collecting taxes and maintaining irrigation works, had quietly begun compiling a private ledger of disappearances and suspicious deaths. He did not yet dare send the document to Chang'an, but he shared fragments of it with a circle of trusted friends, fellow minor officials, a retired military captain, and the head of a prominent merchant clan. Word of this discreet activity reached one of Liu Pengli's informants. Rather than arrest Wei immediately, the prince decided to make an example. On a warm evening in the 4th lunar month, as cherry blossoms drifted across the town's narrow lanes, a raiding party of 30 men descended upon Wei's residence. The official had taken precautions, extra guards, reinforced gates, but the prince's men were professionals now, skilled at silent infiltration. They scaled the outer wall, killed the sentries with garrots, and entered the inner courtyard before the household fully awoke. Wei himself fought with desperate courage, wielding a long staff and wounding 3 attackers before a sword found his chest. His wife and 2 daughters were killed in their chambers. His teenage son, who had been studying in an adjoining room, managed to escape through a rear window, bleeding from a gash across his shoulder. The raiders looted the house methodically, then set fire to the main hall as a warning. By dawn, the building was smoldering ruins, and the town woke to the smell of smoke and the sight of bodies laid out in the courtyard. The surviving son, barely 16, fled westward, eventually finding refuge with relatives in a neighboring commandery. There he changed his name, grew his hair long to disguise himself, and began a new life under the protection of a sympathetic magistrate. But the memory of that night never left him. He memorized every detail he could recall of the attackers, the prince's voice issuing orders from the shadows, the distinctive pattern on the hilt of one man's sword, the laughter that carried across the flames. Years later, when the opportunity finally arose, those memories would prove devastating. Meanwhile, in Chang'an, the imperial capital, the atmosphere was one of cautious expansion and military preoccupation. Emperor Wu had consolidated his power after years of regency intrigue and was now fully committed to the great northern campaigns against the Xiongnu. Generals such as Wei Qing and Hu Quibang were leading punishing expeditions deep into the steppe, winning stunning victories that expanded Han territory and secured lucrative tribute. The court buzzed with talk of strategy, supply lines, and the recruitment of horse archers from allied tribes. Against this backdrop of martial glory, reports of disorder in a minor principality like Jidong seemed trivial. Yet trivial matters have a way of accumulating. Tax receipts from Jidong had declined steadily for several years. Local officials blamed poor harvests, flooding, banditry, anything but the truth. Imperial inspectors sent to audit the accounts returned with vague, contradictory stories. A few bolder memorials reached the throne, written in the careful, indirect language required when criticizing a member of the imperial clan. They spoke of unrest among the people, depopulation of villages, abandonment of fields. None named Liu Pengli directly. To do so would have been political suicide. Still, the emperor's advisors began to take notice. Around 123 BC, a particularly damning account arrived by way of an escaped retainer. The man, once a low-ranking member of the prince's inner circle, had fled after witnessing an especially gruesome raid in which an entire wedding party was massacred for sport. He made his way south, then west, eventually reaching the capital under an assumed identity. There he sought out a minor functionary in the Ministry of Justice, offering information in exchange for protection. The functionary, sensing the explosive nature of the accusations, passed the matter upward through cautious channels. By the time the story reached higher officials, it had been diluted, softened, wrapped in layers of circumspection. Yet the core remained. A Han prince was systematically murdering his own subjects. Emperor Wu, when finally briefed, reacted with characteristic pragmatism. He did not immediately order an investigation. Such a move would have signaled weakness and invited factional intrigue at court. Instead, he instructed the commandant of justice to quietly gather more evidence. Spies were dispatched, disguised as merchants, traveling monks, or government couriers. They were to observe, listen, and report without provoking the prince. At the same time, the emperor increased scrutiny of Jidong's annual tribute and tax submissions, looking for discrepancies that might justify intervention on fiscal rather than criminal grounds. Liu Pengli, however, remained blissfully unaware of the tightening net. His confidence had grown into something close to megalomania. He began staging mock trials in his palace, dressing captives in the robes of minor officials and sentencing them for imaginary crimes before executing them in the courtyard for the entertainment of his followers. He commissioned artisans to carve wooden plaques commemorating particularly memorable raids, hanging them in a private gallery like trophies. To the outside world, he maintained the facade of a proper prince, attending seasonal rituals, presenting gifts at the ancestral temple, sending routine memorials to the throne affirming his loyalty. But inside Jidong, the atmosphere had become almost apocalyptic. Villages that still stood did so in a state of siege mentality. Watch fires burned all night on hilltops. Young men patrolled in shifts armed with farm tools and makeshift spears. Women and children slept in hidden cellars. Some communities pooled resources to hire private guards, former soldiers, or martial artists who had fled other troubles. A rudimentary system of signal fires and runners sprang up, warning neighboring settlements when strangers were sighted. For the first time since the prince began his campaign, organized resistance flickered into existence, small and fragile but real. Among those quietly preparing for the day of reckoning was the young man who had once been called the son of official Wei. Now known by a new name in his place of refuge, he had spent years honing both mind and body. He studied military texts, practiced sword and spear, learned to ride, and most importantly, cultivated connections among officials who quietly despised the Liu clan's excesses. He understood that justice would not come from impulsive vengeance, but from patient accumulation of proof, from building alliances, from waiting until the prince's arrogance finally overreached. As 122 BC dawned, the balance of power in Jidong remained tilted heavily toward Liu Pengli. His palace still stood impregnable, his band still roamed with near impunity, his name still inspired terror. Yet the ground beneath him was no longer solid. Whispers had become murmurs, murmurs had become discreet reports had begun their slow ascent to the steps of the imperial throne. The prince continued his nocturnal hunts, certain of his invulnerability. 122 BC. The reckoning begins. The first cracks of imperial scrutiny in the winter of 122 BC, as frost settled over the northern plains of Jidong and the Yellow River carried thin sheets of ice downstream. The long shadow cast by Liu Pengli began, almost imperceptibly at first, to shorten. The machinery of Han imperial justice, deliberate, vast, and unhurried, had finally stirred. Emperor Wu, now in the 18th year of his reign, had grown accustomed to decisive action on distant frontiers. The great victories of Wei Qing and the young Hu Quabang had pushed the Xiongnu far to the north, opened new commanderies, and filled the imperial treasury with tribute horses and surrendered chieftains. Yet even a ruler preoccupied with steppe conquests could not forever ignore a cancer festering within the very heartland of the empire. The turning point came not from a single dramatic revelation, but from the slow accumulation of small, stubborn facts. Escaped retainers, terrified widows who had walked for weeks to reach safer jurisdictions, tax ledgers that showed inexplicable shortfalls, memorial after memorial written in the most circumspect language, all these threads gradually wove themselves into a pattern too clear to dismiss. By early 122 BC, the Commandant of Justice had compiled a confidential dossier. It did not yet accuse the Prince of Jidong by name in any formal document. Instead, it spoke of a certain noble of the imperial house whose private retainers have repeatedly disturbed the peace of the people, causing widespread flight and depopulation. The euphemism was thin, but it served its purpose. It allowed the emperor to act without immediately branding a blood relative a criminal. Emperor Wu summoned a small council of trusted officials, men known for loyalty and discretion rather than factional ambition. Among them was Zhang Tang, the rising star of the legalist school who would later become Commandant of Justice himself, and Gongsun Hong, the Confucian scholar official whose moral authority helped balance the more ruthless voices at court. The emperor listened in silence as they laid out the evidence, over 100 documented deaths and likely many more unrecorded, systematic robbery under color of noble privilege, the collapse of local administration in entire districts, the credible testimony of multiple deserters from the prince's own household. When the last advisor had spoken, Wu asked only one question: is the evidence sufficient to withstand scrutiny from the Liu clan elders and the Empress Dowager's partisans? The answer was cautious, sufficient to justify an investigation, but not yet sufficient for a public indictment. The emperor nodded once. He issued no grand edict, no dramatic arrest warrant. Instead, he appointed a special commissioner, Dong Zhang, a mid-level official from the Ministry of Justice known for incorruptibility and a calm temperament, to travel to Jidong under the innocuous pretext of conducting a census and auditing land registers. Dong Zhang carried sealed credentials granting him authority to question local officials, inspect princely retainers, and most crucially, take sworn depositions from any subject who wished to speak. He was accompanied by a small retinue of 30 trusted clerks and guards, enough to protect him but not enough to appear as an invading army. Liu Pengli learned of the commissioner's impending arrival through his network of informants in the capital. At first he laughed. A census, land audits, these were routine annoyances every prince endured. He ordered his household to prepare the usual displays of hospitality, banquets, rare wines, gifts of silk and jade for the imperial envoy. Yet something in the tone of the reports unsettled him. The commissioner was not one of the usual placid bureaucrats who could be bribed or intimidated. This Dong Zhang had a reputation for precision and persistence. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the prince felt the faint, unfamiliar sensation of vulnerability. When Dong Zhang arrived in the Jidong capital in the 3rd lunar month of 122 BC, he was received with all outward courtesy. Liu Pengli hosted a lavish welcome banquet in the main hall of the palace. The prince, dressed in robes of deep purple embroidered with gold dragons, played the gracious host perfectly, inquiring after the emperor's health, praising the recent victories over the Xiongnu, offering toasts to the longevity of the dynasty. Dong Zhang responded with equal politeness, complimenting the beauty of the palace gardens and the quality of the wine. Neither man mentioned the true purpose of the visit. For the next several weeks, the commissioner conducted himself with meticulous correctness. He inspected granaries, reviewed tax rolls, measured fields, interviewed village headmen. Everywhere he went, he asked the same set of seemingly innocuous questions. How many households in your village 5 years ago? How many now? What caused the difference? Have any notable incidents disturbed the peace recently? Most officials, long accustomed to fear, gave evasive answers. But in private, in small rooms with doors closed and only 1 or 2 trusted witnesses present, a different story began to emerge. The first breakthrough came from an elderly widow in a hamlet 20 li east of the princely capital. Her husband and 2 sons had vanished during a night raid 6 years earlier. She had never dared speak publicly, but something in Dong Zhang's quiet demeanor, the absence of arrogance, the patience with which he listened, gave her courage. She told him everything: the hoofbeats at midnight, the screams, the fire, the bodies left in a ditch. When asked if she knew who led the raiders, she whispered one word: the prince. Dong Zhang recorded her testimony word for word, had her mark the document with her thumbprint, and swore her to secrecy until the proper time. Others followed: a blacksmith whose apprentice had been killed for sport, a merchant whose caravan had been ambushed, a former retainer who had fled the palace after witnessing Liu Pengli personally behead a captive girl who had begged for mercy. Each deposition was taken in secret, copies made, originals sealed and stored under guard. By the end of the 2nd month, Dong Zhang had collected 17 sworn statements directly implicating the prince. The number was still small compared to the scale of the crimes, but it was enough to justify escalation. Liu Pengli, meanwhile, began to sense the change in atmosphere. Officials who once bowed deeply now avoided his eyes. Banquets grew sparsely attended. Informants reported that the imperial commissioner was spending long hours in private meetings with village elders. The prince's temper, never gentle, became volatile. He ordered several suspected informants flogged. 2 died under the bamboo. He doubled the size of his night patrols, hoping to intimidate the populace into renewed silence. Yet the silence was breaking. In the 6th lunar month, Dongzhang quietly dispatched a sealed courier to Chang'an carrying the accumulated depositions and a personal memorial to the emperor. The document was careful, almost painfully restrained, yet its meaning was unmistakable. There existed credible, corroborated evidence that the Prince of Jidong had, over many years, caused the wrongful death of numerous subjects, disturbed public order, and brought shame upon the imperial house. The commissioner requested authority to place the prince under temporary house arrest pending further investigation. When the reply arrived from the capital 7 weeks later, it was terse. The emperor approved the request. He also ordered that Liu Pengli be summoned to Chang'an to explain certain matters to the throne. The prince was given 30 days to prepare for the journey. A detachment of imperial troops, 200 men under a trusted general, was already en route to Jidong to escort him. Liu Pengli received the edict in his private audience chamber. For a long moment he said nothing, merely staring at the yellow silk scroll bearing the imperial seal. Then he laughed, a short, harsh sound without mirth. He dismissed his attendants, walked alone to the gallery where he kept his carved wooden plaques commemorating past raids, and stood before them in silence. For the first time in his adult life, the Prince of Jidong understood that the game might be ending. He did not panic. Panic was for lesser men. Instead, he began to plan. Messengers rode out under cover of darkness, carrying coded letters to distant relatives, to powerful officials who owed him favors, to old allies in the Imperial Guard. He summoned his most loyal retainers and quietly ordered them to prepare for contingencies, horses saddled, gold packed, escape routes mapped. Above all, he instructed them to destroy anything that could serve as evidence: the wooden plaques, certain ledgers, the private gallery itself. Flames consumed much of the record of his crimes that night. Yet not everything could be burned. Memories could not be burned. Living witnesses could not be burned, at least not all of them, not quickly enough. As autumn deepened and the leaves turned crimson along the riverbanks, the imperial escort arrived at the gates of Jidong City. Their banners bore the dragon emblem of the Son of Heaven. Their commander presented the emperor's command with perfect formality. Liu Pengli, dressed in his finest robes, emerged from the palace to meet them. He smiled, bowed, spoke gracious words of loyalty. No one who watched him that day would have guessed that the man who had terrorized an entire region for nearly 20 years was, at last, being led toward judgment. 122 BC, 121 BC, the road to Chang'an flight, pursuit, and the unraveling the imperial edict was clear and absolute. Liu Pengli, Prince of Jidong, was to present himself at the capital within 30 days to answer questions before the Son of Heaven. Accompanying the scroll came the detachment of 200 imperial troops under General Li Guangli, no relation to the famous frontier commander Li Guang, but a stern, capable officer chosen precisely because he had no personal ties to the Liu princely houses. The general's orders were explicit: escort the prince with all due honor, yet ensure he did not deviate from the prescribed route or delay beyond the appointed time. Politely worded, the command left no room for interpretation. This was not an invitation, it was a summons. When the banners of the imperial escort appeared at the southern gate of the Jidong capital on a crisp morning in the 8th lunar month, the city held its breath. Shopkeepers lowered their shutters early. Mothers pulled children indoors. Even the usual street vendors vanished into alleys. Liu Pengli emerged from his palace dressed for the occasion. Robes of imperial yellow trimmed in black and gold, a jade belt of office, hair bound in the formal style of a high noble. His face showed nothing but calm dignity. He bowed to General Lei with perfect propriety, spoke gracious words of gratitude for the escort, and invited the officers to a farewell banquet that evening before the journey began at first light. Behind the composed facade, however, the prince's mind raced. He had spent the previous weeks in feverish preparation. Trusted retainers, those few who had shared in his crimes from the beginning, had already slipped out of the city in ones and twos, disguised as merchants, monks, or common laborers. They carried with them small chests of gold, letters of introduction to distant relatives in southern commanderies, and instructions to lie low until the storm passed. The wooden plaques from the private gallery had been burned, incriminating ledgers soaked in oil and set alight in a remote courtyard. Yet Liu Pengli knew that living witnesses remained. Every man who had ridden at his side over the years was a potential blade turned against him. That night the palace banquet unfolded with forced splendor. Musicians played, dancers swirled, rare delicacies from the southern seas appeared on lacquered trays. Liu Pengli toasted the emperor's health, praised General Li's valor, laughed at appropriate moments. But his eyes never stopped moving, counting heads, noting who drank too deeply, who avoided his gaze. Toward midnight he excused himself, claiming fatigue from the impending journey, and retired to his private chambers. He did not sleep. Instead he met in secret with his foremost loyal captains, men who had killed at his command for nearly 2 decades. In a small, windowless room lit only by a single oil lamp, he laid out the plan. They would not go meekly to Chang'an. The moment the escort column left the city walls and entered the first stretch of open road along the northern bank of the river, they would strike. A larger force, perhaps 300 men drawn from scattered loyalists who had been quietly assembling in nearby villages, would ambush the column at a narrow defile 30 li from the city. The prince and his inner circle would cut through the confusion, seize horses, and ride south toward the marshes and hills where pursuit would be difficult. From there they could make for the Yangtze region, seek sanctuary with sympathetic clans, or even cross into the semi-independent territories still beyond full hand control. Gold had already been sent ahead to bribe local officials along the escape route. The captains listened in silence. They understood the risk. To raise hand against Imperial troops was high treason, punishable by extermination of the entire clan to the 9th degree. Yet they also understood that surrender meant certain execution, perhaps preceded by torture and public humiliation. They nodded assent. The die was cast. At dawn the column formed outside the palace gates. Liu Pengli mounted a fine black stallion presented by the general as a gesture of courtesy. Behind him rode 20 of his personal retainers, all unarmed as protocol demanded, though each man carried at least one concealed dagger beneath his robes. The Imperial troops formed a protective square around the prince. General Li rode at the head, flanked by standard bearers and drummers. The gates opened. The procession moved slowly through streets lined with silent, watching faces. No cheers rose, no flowers were thrown. Only the clatter of hooves and the creak of cartwheels broke the stillness. They traveled unmolested for the first day and a half. The road followed the river, broad and well-maintained, dotted with postal stations and small garrisons. At each stop the prince behaved impeccably, sharing tea with local officials, inquiring after harvests, praising the emperor's wise governance. General Li, however, was no fool. He doubled the night watch, kept the prince's retainers under constant observation, and sent scouts ranging far ahead into the flanks. The blow fell on the morning of the 3rd day, just as the column entered the predicted defile, a narrow passage between 2 low wooded hills where the road squeezed between rock outcrops and the riverbank. As the vanguard passed the choke point, signal arrows streaked from the tree line on both sides. Shouts erupted. Armed men, nearly 400 now, poured down the slopes. They wore no uniform, only dark cloaks and cloth masks, but their discipline betrayed long familiarity with violence. The Imperial troops reacted swiftly. General Li roared orders, shields locked into a defensive wall, crossbowmen dropped to one knee and began loosing bolts. For several frantic minutes, the outcome hung in balance. Liu Pengli, still mounted in the center of the melee, drew the ceremonial sword at his belt and cut down the first soldier who reached for his reins. His retainers rallied around him, fighting with the desperation of condemned men, but the ambushers had miscalculated. General Li had anticipated treachery. Hidden reserves, another 100 men concealed in reed beds along the river, emerged at the critical moment and struck the attackers from the rear. The tide turned. The prince's force, caught between 2 disciplined lines, began to crumble. Bodies piled in the dust. Horses screamed and bolted. Blood soaked the earth. Liu Pengli saw the battle turning. With a curse, he spurred his stallion toward a gap in the line, followed by only 6 of his captains. They crashed through a thin screen of infantry, gained the riverbank, and plunged into the shallows, hoping to lose pursuit in the reed-choked marshes beyond. General Lei, bloodied but unhorsed, bellowed for archers. A flight of arrows hissed after the fleeing riders. 2 of the captains fell, another slipped from his saddle, clutching a shaft in his throat. Liu Pengli rode on, crouched low, the horse laboring through mud and water. They reached the far bank and disappeared into the dense willow thickets. General Li called off immediate pursuit. The prince was wounded, his force shattered, his escape route known. Instead, he secured the battlefield, tended the wounded, counted the dead. 43 Imperial troops had fallen, over 200 of the attackers lay scattered across the defile. Among the captured were several of Liu Pengli's longest-serving retainers. Under interrogation, they quickly broke, naming names, revealing safe houses, confessing to years of murder and robbery under the prince's command. Word of the ambush reached Chang'an within 10 days. Emperor Wu received the report in private audience. His face remained impassive, but those closest to him noted the tightening of his jaw, the coldness in his eyes. He issued a new decree. Liu Pengli was now formally declared a fugitive traitor. A bounty of 10,000 cash was placed on his head, dead or alive. Every commandery along the Yangtze and Huai rivers was ordered to seal borders, search villages, interrogate travelers. Surviving members of the prince's household were rounded up in Jidong. His palace was sealed and searched. Hidden caches of gold and weapons were uncovered beneath garden pavilions. Liu Pengli, meanwhile, limped deeper into the southern marshes with only 3 surviving followers. A crossbow bolt had grazed his left thigh. Fever set in quickly. They moved by night, hiding by day in fishermen's huts and abandoned shrines. The prince's once commanding presence shrank. He spoke little, ate less, stared for hours at the slow-moving water as though it held answers. His companions, hardened killers, all began to whisper among themselves. Loyalty is strong, but survival is stronger. By the early winter of 121 BC, they reached a small river town near the border of a neighboring principality. Exhausted, half-starved, they sought shelter in a derelict warehouse by the docks. There, in the pre-dawn darkness, one of the 3 captains slipped away. He returned an hour later with a squad of local militia, men who had received the imperial proclamation and recognized the bounty. The fight was brief and one-sided. Liu Pengli, weakened by fever and blood loss, managed to kill 1 man before being overwhelmed. Iron manacles closed around his wrists. A rope was tied around his neck like a common criminal. He was transported north under heavy guard, first by boat, then by cage cart along the Imperial highway. Crowds gathered at every town to jeer and throw refuse. The once arrogant Prince of Jidong arrived in Chang'an in chains, gaunt, feverish, his fine robes replaced by a prisoner's tunic of coarse hemp. The emperor did not grant him an immediate audience. Instead, Liu Pengli was confined in the imperial prison reserved for high nobles, a cold, clean cell beneath the palace, guarded day and night. There he waited day after day while commissioners compiled the final mountain of evidence: depositions, captured documents, testimony from captured retainers, even fragments of burned ledgers recovered from the palace ashes. At last, in the spring of 121 BC, the trial began. 121 BC. Judgment in the Dragon Hall. The trial of Liu Pengli in the spring of 121 BC. When plum blossoms had barely begun to open along the palace canals of Chang'an, the great judgment hall known as the Dragon Pavilion was prepared for one of the most extraordinary proceedings in the history of the Western Han. The hall itself was not the largest in the Huaiyang Palace complex, but it was the most solemn. A vast rectangular chamber of polished cedar and lacquered black pillars, its ceiling painted with coiling golden dragons amid clouds, its floor of dark marble veined with white like frozen rivers. At the northern end rose the imperial dais, 5 steps high, surmounted by a throne of carved sandalwood draped in yellow silk embroidered with 5 clawed dragons, the sole prerogative of the Son of Heaven. Flanking the throne stood bronze censers from which sandalwood incense rose in slow, fragrant spirals. No banners, no unnecessary ornament, only severity and majesty. On the appointed day, long before dawn, the hall began to fill. First came the officials of the 9 ministers, clad in their prescribed court robes of deep crimson and black. Then the erudites and academicians of the Imperial University, men whose lives were spent debating the classics, yet who now gathered to witness a violation of every Confucian principle they taught. Representatives of the great noble houses were present, their expressions carefully neutral. No one wished to be seen either too close to or too distant from the accused. Finally, in a screened gallery to one side, sat members of the Imperial Liu clan, distant cousins, uncles by marriage, senior princesses, watching in uneasy silence. The Empress Dowager had chosen not to attend. Her absence was itself a statement. Liu Pengli was brought in last under heavy guard. Gone were the princely robes of yellow and gold. He wore the plain hemp tunic and trousers of a common criminal, his hair unbound and falling in disarray over his shoulders, his once handsome face gaunt from fever and captivity. Iron manacles linked his wrists. A wooden cane had been removed only moments before to allow him to kneel. Yet even in degradation he carried himself with a remnant of arrogance, head high, eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at the floor as lesser prisoners would. When the guards forced him to his knees before the dais, he complied slowly, almost deliberately, as though granting a favor. A low bell sounded. All rose. Emperor Wu entered from a side door, attended only by 2 eunuchs and the commandant of the palace guards. He was 44 years old at the height of his powers, tall, broad-shouldered, his beard neatly trimmed, his gaze steady and unreadable. He wore no crown, only the simple yellow robe of state, yet the very air seemed to thicken in his presence. He ascended the dais, seated himself, and regarded the kneeling figure below without expression. The trial began with no flourish, no grand proclamation. Zhang Tang, now promoted to Commandant of Justice, stepped forward holding a bamboo scroll 3 feet long. In a voice clear and unhurried, he began to read the indictment. It was not a single charge, but a litany that unfolded like a scroll of horrors. From the year 144 BC, upon succeeding to the princedom of Jidong, the accused had gathered bands of armed retainers, slaves, fugitives, disaffected youths, and led them on repeated nocturnal raids against the common people. Murder, robbery, arson, rape, mutilation, the list continued without pause. Specific cases were cited: the massacre of the merchant family near the eastern border in 132 BC, the burning of official Wei's household in 124 BC, the slaughter of an entire wedding procession in 123 BC, the systematic extermination of entire hamlets whose only crime was prosperity or simple bad fortune. Over 130 named victims were enumerated, with the clear understanding that many more had gone unrecorded. Witnesses 17 from Dong Zhang's investigation, plus 34 more who had come forward after the prince's capture, had given sworn testimony. Captured retainers under interrogation had confirmed the prince's direct leadership and personal participation in many killings. As Zhang Tang read, no sound broke the silence except the rustle of bamboo slips and the soft crackle of incense. Liu Pengli knelt motionless, eyes fixed on some invisible point above the emperor's head. Only once, when the name of a particular victim, a girl of 14 whose final pleas the prince had mocked, was spoken, did a faint twitch pass across his mouth, quickly suppressed. When the indictment concluded, Zhang Tang rolled the scroll and stepped back. Emperor Wu spoke for the first time. "Liu Pengli, you have heard the accusations. Do you dispute them?" The prince raised his head. His voice, though hoarse from weeks of silence, remained steady. "I do not dispute that raids occurred. I do not dispute that men died, but I am of the imperial blood. My actions, however severe, were taken within my own fief to maintain order and punish the disobedient. The Son of Heaven grants princes the right to govern their domains as they see fit." A murmur rippled through the hall, shock, outrage, disbelief. Even among the hardened officials, few had expected such naked defiance. Emperor Wu leaned forward slightly. "You claim the right to slaughter your own people for sport, to burn homes, violate daughters, murder children, all under the guise of maintaining order." Liu Pengli met the emperor's gaze without flinching. "I claim the right of a prince to judge." The people of Jidong grew insolent. They withheld taxes, sheltered fugitives, whispered against the imperial house. I corrected them. If blood was spilled, it was necessary blood. Another murmur, louder. Several officials turned their faces away in disgust. The emperor allowed the silence to stretch. Then he spoke again, each word measured. The mandate of heaven rests upon virtue. A ruler who kills without cause, who delights in death, who turns his fief into a hunting ground for human prey, forfeits that mandate. You are not correcting, you are praying. You are not governing, you are destroying. He gestured. Gongsun Hong, the senior Confucian advisor, stepped forward. In calm, measured tones, he recited passages from the Analects, the Book of Documents, the Spring and Autumn Annals, texts that spoke of the ruler's duty to protect life, to govern with benevolence, to punish only after due process. Each citation was a nail driven into the prince's defense. Liu Pengli listened without interruption. When Gongsun Hong finished, he laughed once, a short, bitter sound. Virtue is a fine word for courtiers who sit safe in Chang'an. Out in the provinces, strength rules. I ruled with strength. Emperor Wu raised a hand. The hall fell silent. Strength without virtue is tyranny. Tyranny is the mark of one who has already lost the mandate. He turned to the assembled officials. Let those who have testimony speak. One by one they came forward, the elderly widow whose husband and sons had vanished. The blacksmith's apprentice who had hidden in a grain bin while his master was cut down. The escaped retainer who described the prince's private gallery of carved plaques, each commemorating a massacre. A surviving son from the wedding party slaughter, now 23, who identified Liu Pengli's voice from the darkness that night. Each witness knelt, spoke briefly, clearly, and withdrew. None looked at the prisoner with hatred, only with the dull exhaustion of those who had carried grief too long. Liu Pengli did not speak again. He knelt through every testimony, face impassive, eyes distant. At last the emperor rose. This court has heard enough. He descended the dais, stopping 3 paces from the kneeling prince. For a long moment the two men, one enthroned by heaven, the other fallen from every grace, regarded each other. Liu Pengli, the emperor said quietly, you are stripped of your princely title, your fief, your lands, your wealth, and your membership in the imperial clan. Your household is dissolved. Your surviving retainers will be judged separately. You yourself will be reduced to the status of a commoner and exiled to Shangyong in the distant commandery of Hanjia, there to live out your days under guard and supervision. Your name will be erased from the genealogical records of the Liu house. No descendants of yours shall ever hold office or noble rank. A pause. Execution was recommended. I have chosen otherwise, not for mercy, but because I will not give you the quick release of death. Live and remember what you have done. Live and let every day be a reminder that the Son of Heaven sees, judges, and punishes even those of his own blood. Liu Pengli said nothing, no plea, no curse, no final defiance. The arrogance had finally cracked, leaving only emptiness. Guards lifted him to his feet. As he was led away, the hall remained silent. No cheers, no jeers. Only the soft hiss of incense and the shuffle of feet on marble. Liu Pengli was removed from Chang'an that same night, placed in a closed cart and sent south under heavy escort. He reached Shangyong the following spring. There, in a small guarded compound on the edge of a remote mountain valley, he lived for some years more. How many, the records do not say. No further accounts of his words or deeds survive. He died in obscurity, unmourned, unremembered, except in the nightmares of those whose lives he had touched. Jidong slowly recovered. Villages were rebuilt, fields replanted, markets reopened. The terror faded into story, then into legend, the tale of the prince who hunted men for sport and of the emperor who finally brought him down. Yet in the annals of human darkness, Liu Pengli holds a grim distinction. He was not the last to kill for pleasure, but he was among the first whose name history bothered to record. 121 BC onward, echoes of the shadow legacy, reflection, and the long silence with the closing of the heavy cedar doors behind the shackled Liu Pengli as he was led from the dragon pavilion. An era of private terror in one corner of the Han Empire came to its official end. Yet endings in history are rarely clean. They ripple outward, reshaping institutions, memories, and the quiet assumptions people carry about power and safety. The case of the Prince of Jidong did not vanish into the archives the moment the emperor pronounced sentence. Instead, it lodged like a thorn in the collective consciousness of the dynasty, influencing policy, legal thought, and even the way later historians chose to remember, or carefully forget, the darker possibilities of imperial blood. In the immediate aftermath, Emperor Wu moved with characteristic thoroughness to cauterize the wound. The fief of Jidong was not merely reduced, it was effectively dissolved as an autonomous princedom. Its territory was carved into smaller commanderies placed directly under appointees sent from Chang'an. The old princely palace, its gardens trampled, its private gallery reduced to ash, was repurposed first as a regional administrative center, then gradually allowed to fall into ruin. Local officials who had turned blind eyes or taken bribes during the years of terror faced quiet purges, demotions, banishments, in a few egregious cases execution on charges of dereliction of duty or collusion with malefactors. No grand spectacle was made of these punishments. Wu understood that public humiliation of too many mid-level bureaucrats could destabilize administration. The lesson was delivered discreetly but unmistakably. More lasting was the shift in policy toward the vassal kingdoms. The Liu Pengli affair became one of several high-profile scandals, along with the earlier rebellions of Liu Wu of Huainan and Liu and of Hengshan, that convinced Emperor Wu and his advisors that the old system of enfiefing imperial relatives with large, semi-independent domains carried unacceptable risk. The reductions of vassal states policy, already underway, accelerated. Over the next 2 decades, the central government steadily chipped away at princely privileges, limiting the size of private armies, requiring annual personal attendance at court for younger princes, stationing imperial garrison commanders inside princely capitals for protection. The principle was simple and ruthless. Blood ties alone would no longer guarantee unchecked power. Virtue, loyalty, and above all, utility to the throne would determine how much autonomy any noble retained. Historians of later generations treated Liu Pengli with a mixture of reticence and pointed moralism. Sima Qian, writing the Shijai only a few decades after the events, devoted only a brief, almost laconic passage to him in the Hereditary Houses section. He noted the appointment to Jidong, the accusations of cruelty, the ambush on the road to Chang'an, the trial, and the sentence of exile, then moved on. Bangu, compiling the Han Shu in the following century, was somewhat more expansive but still restrained. Both men belonged to a historiographical tradition that preferred to let vice condemn itself through understatement rather than lurid detail. Yet the very brevity carried weight. By refusing to dwell, they signaled that such depravity was an aberration unworthy of extended glorification, even in condemnation. For the common people of Jidong and the surrounding regions, the memory lingered longer and in darker forms. Oral traditions preserved stories of the night-hunting prince well into the eastern Han and beyond. In some villages, children were warned not to stray after dusk lest Liu Pengli's riders return. Over time, the historical figure blurred into folklore, a demon prince who could smell fear, whose eyes glowed like foxfire, whose laughter echoed on moonless nights. Temples to local earth gods and protective deities saw small spikes in offerings during the reigns of later weak emperors, as though rural communities feared that any loosening of central control might allow another such monster to rise. From a modern vantage, looking back across more than 21 centuries, Liu Pengli's case holds an uncomfortable place in the early catalogue of serial predation. He was not driven by political necessity, religious zeal, financial gain, or even personal vengeance. The motive, as near as the sparse records allow us to see, was pleasure in the act itself. The control, the terror inflicted, the momentary godlike power over other human lives. In that sense, he prefigures patterns that criminologists would later recognize in far more recent figures, thrill-oriented, hedonistic, seemingly untouched by ordinary human empathy. That such behavior could emerge within the highest stratum of one of the ancient world's most sophisticated bureaucracies and Confucian moral orders is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all. Yet the Han response also offers a counterpoint. There was no romanticization of the killer, no mythologizing of his tragic grandeur. the state did not hesitate to apply the law even to one of its own blood. Emperor Wu himself, no gentle ruler, chose demotion and lifelong exile over execution, perhaps calculating that a living symbol of imperial justice humbled was more useful than a dead one swiftly forgotten. The punishment was not mercy, it was prolonged erasure, to be stripped of name, lineage, status, and legacy, then sent to rot in a distant mountain backwater. That was, in hand terms, a death of the soul long before the body failed. No reliable record survives of Liu Pengli's final years in Shangyong. The commandery lay in rugged hill country near the headwaters of the Han River, far from major trade routes, its population sparse and its officials content to be forgotten. A small guarded residence was built for him on a terraced slope overlooking a narrow valley. A handful of elderly attendants, chosen for their lack of ambition and their indifference, saw to his basic needs. He was forbidden visitors, correspondence, or any contact beyond the minimum required to confirm he still breathed. What thoughts passed through his mind in that isolation, whether regret ever touched him, or whether he simply waited out the years in the same cold detachment he had once inflicted on others, no document records. He died sometime between 115 BC and 110 BC. The exact date was not considered worth preserving. His body was buried in an unmarked grave on the hillside behind the residence, without ceremony or ancestral tablet. When the last attendant passed away some years later, the compound was abandoned. Local farmers gradually dismantled the walls for building stone. Within a generation, nothing remained but a faint rectangular depression in the earth and a few scattered roof tiles half buried in grass. Today, even the precise location of that grave, if it still exists, is unknown. Shangyong's administrative boundaries have shifted across dynasties. The name itself has changed multiple times. Modern maps place the old commandery somewhere in the vicinity of present-day Zhejiang County, Hubei Province, but no marker, no stele, no local legend points to the spot. The land has reclaimed its silence, and perhaps that is the most fitting conclusion. Liu Pengli sought to leave a mark through terror, to etch his name into the minds of the living through fear. History and the deliberate choice of those who wrote it denied him even that. He became instead a brief, dark footnote, proof that absolute power can corrupt absolutely, that even royal blood carries no immunity to moral rot, and that empires, when sufficiently alarmed, will turn upon their own monsters. The shadow he cast over Jidong faded with time, as shadows do. Fields were tilled again. Children played in the roads at dusk. Travelers once more used the old highways without looking over their shoulders. Life resumed, quieter for the memory, but not defined by it. Yet somewhere in the long chain of human experience, the name endures, quiet, uncelebrated, unexcused, as one of the earliest recorded instances of a man who killed repeatedly, deliberately, and solely because it pleased him to do so. There are no further documented events, no surviving personal letters, no archaeological traces, no additional court records that name him after his exile to Shangyong. The historical thread simply stops. What remains is silence, and that silence itself became part of the story. In the centuries that followed, Chinese historiography rarely revisited the Prince of Jidong. When later dynasties compiled their own official histories, they drew lessons from the Han not by dwelling on individual monsters, but by reinforcing structural safeguards against them. Tang, Song, Ming, and Qing courts all inherited and expanded the mechanisms first sharpened during Emperor Wu's reign. Tighter surveillance of noble houses, more frequent rotation of regional governors, harsher penalties for officials who concealed crimes committed by their superiors, and perhaps most importantly, an enduring cultural insistence that moral legitimacy, not merely bloodline, justified the exercise of power. Yet in the popular imagination, the figure never entirely disappeared. He lived on in fragmented folktales, cautionary bedtime stories, and the occasional ghost opera performed in rural market towns during the Mid-Autumn Festival. In these retellings, the details shifted and grew fantastical. Sometimes he rode a black horse whose hooves left no prints. Sometimes his shadow moved independently of his body. Sometimes the souls of his victims followed him into exile, whispering at night until he clawed at his own ears in madness. The core, however, the young prince who killed for pleasure, remained constant. Storytellers needed no embellishment there. Reality had already supplied the horror. By the time printed vernacular literature flourished in the Ming dynasty, Liu Pengli occasionally appeared as a minor antagonist in sprawling historical romances. He was never the central villain, too obscure, too lacking in grand ambition, but rather a dark example of what could happen when private vice was allowed to fester behind the screen of noble privilege. Authors used him to underscore a favorite moral, that even the son of heaven's own kin could fall into bestiality if virtue were not constantly cultivated. In the 20th century, as Western criminological concepts reached China, scholars quietly rediscovered the case. A few academic papers published in the 1980s and 1990s drew parallels between Liu Pengli and modern typologies of hedonistic serial murder. They noted the absence of financial or sexual compulsion in most of the recorded raids, though violations sometimes occurred as an afterthought. The emphasis on thrill and dominance, the escalation over decades, the careful selection of vulnerable targets, the grooming of a loyal cadre of accomplices. They pointed out that he displayed many of the traits now grouped under severe antisocial personality disorder with prominent psychopathic features: grandiosity, lack of remorse, shallow affect, callous disregard for others, parasitic lifestyle within his own domain. Yet these analyses remained niche. The ancient case was too remote, the documentation too sparse, to attract widespread attention outside specialist circles. Today, if one searches Chinese digital databases or academic repositories for Chinese letter, Liu Pengli, the results are meager. A handful of encyclopedia entries, several brief mentions in broader surveys of Han social history, one or two journal articles comparing him to other early figures of tyrannical cruelty. He is not celebrated, not vilified at length, not turned into popular entertainment. He simply exists as a data point, a very early, very clear example that the impulse to hunt and destroy other humans for pleasure is not a modern invention, nor a product of any particular culture or era. It is older than empires, older than written law, older than the very idea of history itself. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson the long silence teaches. When a society confronts such a figure, it has two choices. It can mythologize him, turn him into a larger-than-life symbol of evil, a devil whose story is told and retold until the telling becomes a kind of dark fascination. Or it can do what the Han court ultimately did, strip away every marker of importance, reduce him to a common criminal, erase his name from genealogies, banish him to a forgotten valley, and let time and bureaucracy finish the obliteration. The first path keeps the monster alive in memory, the second seeks to starve him of meaning. Neither path erases the fact that he existed. Neither path guarantees that another will not rise in some future generation under some other name, wearing some other title. But the second path at least denies him the immortality of infamy. In the end, that was Emperor Wu's coldest sentence, not death but insignificance. Liu Pengli wanted to be feared forever. Instead, he became a footnote few people read, a name most have never heard, a shadow that faded even from the nightmares of the children of Jidong. 121 BC, 90 BC. The slow healing of Jidong and the invisible scars in the years immediately following Liu Pengli's removal, Jidong did not burst into sudden renewal like a field after spring rain. Healing moved at the pace of exhausted people rebuilding lives one small, careful act at a time. The first visible change was administrative. By 120 BC, the former princely domain had been formally reorganized into two smaller commanderies, Donghai and parts of what became known as Jian, each governed by officials dispatched directly from the capital. These men arrived with crisp new seals, detailed census mandates, and most importantly, modest military escorts of 50 crossbowmen each. The message was unspoken but clear. The center now watched closely. No local noble would be allowed to accumulate private armed retainers again without immediate scrutiny. Tax collection resumed with unaccustomed gentleness for the first decade. Emperor Wu, advised by Gongsun Hong and later by the legalist-minded Zhang Tang, authorized temporary reductions, sometimes as much as 30%, in household levies and corvée labor demands across the former Jidong territory. The official explanation cited recent disturbances and depopulation. The real reason was pragmatic. Empty villages paid no grain, dead farmers grew no millet. A lenient hand for one generation would refill the fields faster than punitive extraction. By 118 BC, census rolls began to show the first faint upward trend. Families who had fled westward into Qi or southward toward the Huai River started to trickle back. Some returned to find their old homes burned to the foundation and their fields gone wild with brambles and foxglove. Others discovered neighbors had quietly incorporated abandoned plots into their own holdings during the years of terror, a practice the new commandery officials mostly tolerated rather than unravel. Land disputes were settled with a bias toward whoever was physically present in farming. Ghosts, after all, filed no claims. Rebuilding followed practical patterns. Villages that had once clustered tightly for mutual defense now spread out again, houses placed farther apart so that a night raid on one would not doom the entire settlement. Watch platforms, simple wooden towers lashed together with hemp rope, appeared on low hills overlooking the main roads. Young men took turns sitting there after dusk with bronze bells and signal arrows, though the habit slowly faded as memories dimmed and no hoofbeats ever came again. Temples and ancestral shrines saw a quiet boom in small offerings. Families who had lost members during the raids commissioned modest wooden tablets inscribed with the names of the dead. These were placed not in grand lineage halls but in humble household altars or village shrines to local earth gods. The prayers were simple and practical. Protect this house from night visitors. Let no shadow fall twice. Over time, some of these shrines acquired informal reputations as especially efficacious against princely evil. Travelers began leaving small coins or rice cakes at them, a custom that persisted into the Eastern Han even after the original reason had blurred into legend. One poignant detail survives in a fragmentary local gazetteer copied centuries later. In several villages, the custom arose of burning a single lantern every mid-autumn festival at the edge of the old princely hunting paths, not to summon spirits, but to guide home any soul still wandering from those dark years. The practice was never widespread, never mentioned in official records, yet it endured for at least 3 generations. By 110 BC, roughly the time Liu Pengli is believed to have died in Shangyong, the demographic picture had stabilized. Population figures approached pre-144 BC levels in the most fertile districts, though many hamlets remained smaller and poorer than before. The silk and lacquer workshops that once supplied the prince's palace never fully recovered their scale. The artisans had either died, fled, or shifted to producing plainer goods for local markets. Iron production, however, increased, partly because the central government encouraged it for military purposes, partly because farmers quietly forged more tools and weapons just in case. A handful of families who had lost everything became quietly prominent in a different way. The son of official Wei, who had escaped the 124 BC massacre and reinvented himself under a new name, eventually returned under his original surname. He did not seek revenge, the prince was already gone, but instead became a low-level clerk in the new commandery office. There he earned a modest reputation for meticulous record-keeping and an almost obsessive insistence that every disappearance, every suspicious death, be documented and forwarded to higher authorities. His colleagues joked that he saw bandits behind every missing pig, but no one mocked him openly. His ledgers were among the cleanest in the region. Another survivor, a woman whose husband and brother had been killed in a raid in 135 BC, never remarried. Instead, she gathered orphan girls from several villages and taught them weaving, sericulture, and basic literacy using scraps of discarded bamboo. By 105 BC, her small household workshop supplied plain silk to the commandery market. Local officials quietly exempted her from certain labor duties. No one needed to explain why. These individual recoveries were never celebrated in court poetry or steel inscriptions. They left no grand monuments, yet they were the true counterweight to Liu Pengli's legacy, ordinary people refusing to let terror be the final word on their lives. In Chang'an itself, the episode was rarely discussed openly after the trial. Emperor Wu had many larger concerns: the Xiongnu Wars, the expansion into the Tarim Basin, the economic strain of maintaining vast frontier garrisons, the growing influence of consort clans. Liu Pengli became one more cautionary tale told to young princes during their education. Remember Jidong, power without virtue ends in chains and a nameless grave. By the time Emperor Zhao ascended in 87 BC, the affair was already passing into the territory of things that happened in our grandfather's day. When the History Office compiled materials for what would become the Han Shu, Bangu included only the briefest notice, enough to preserve the fact of punishment, not enough to keep the name alive in popular memory. And so Jidong healed not spectacularly, not completely, but steadily. Fields were plowed again. Children laughed in the roads at twilight. Lanterns burned on mid-autumn nights for a generation or two, then flickered out. The old princely roads grew over with grass. The name Liu Pengli faded until it was spoken only by village elders when they wanted to frighten grandchildren into coming inside after dark. Eventually even that stopped. The land forgot before the people quite did. And that perhaps was the gentlest form of justice the age could offer. 110 BC Ka. 100 BC, Shangyong, the valley that swallowed a name, Shangyong Commandery, lay far from everything that once mattered to Liu Pengli. Tucked into the steep, mist-filled folds of the Kinling Daba mountain system near the upper Han River, it was a place the central government remembered only when tax quotas were due, or when a new magistrate needed to be punished with a remote posting. The population was thin, mostly poor hill farmers, charcoal burners, a few families of relocated convicts, and the small garrison of 50 soldiers who rotated in every 3 years from Hanzhong. The commandery seat was little more than a wooden stockade with a yamen hall, a granary, and a handful of thatched barracks. Beyond the stockade the hills rose quickly into dense pine and bamboo, cut by narrow trails that led nowhere important. The compound assigned to the former Prince of Jidong stood on a south-facing terrace about 2 li outside the stockade, chosen for its isolation and its single defensible approach. It consisted of a modest main building, 5 bays, tiled roof leaking in heavy rains, 2 side wings for attendants, a small kitchen yard, and a latrine shed. A chest-high wall of rammed earth and uncut stone surrounded the whole, more to keep one man in than to keep anyone out. 2 soldiers were posted at the gate day and night, another 4 patrolled the perimeter path in shifts. The rest of the garrison treated the place as just another boring duty station. Liu Pengli arrived in the autumn of 121 BC, still limping from the crossbow wound taken during the failed ambush, his once regal frame wasted by fever and the long journey south in a jolting prisoner cart. The first magistrate, a cautious, middle-aged man named Chen who had drawn the short straw for this posting, conducted the formal handover without ceremony. He read the Imperial edict aloud in the Yamen courtyard while Liu stood in manacles between 2 guards. The words were already familiar: reduction to commoner status, erasure from the Imperial genealogy, lifelong confinement under guard, no visitors, no letters, no contact beyond necessities. Chen then asked if the prisoner had any requests. Liu Pengli answered only one sentence: see that the roof does not leak. It did leak, of course. Everything in Shangyong leaked when the summer monsoons came. The attendants assigned to him were 4 elderly men, former low-level palace eunuchs and bondservants too old for useful work in Chang'an, sent here as a form of gentle retirement. They had no loyalty to the prisoner, no fear of him, and no interest in his past. Their instructions were simple: keep him fed, keep him alive, keep him inside the compound. They called him nothing but the guest among themselves. To his face they used no title at all. For the first year or 2 he retained fragments of his old manner. He demanded tea prepared a certain way, they ignored him. He tried issuing orders about the cleanliness of his chambers, they swept when they felt like it. He paced the small courtyard at night, staring up at the narrow strip of stars visible between the peaks, as though expecting some imperial messenger to descend from the sky. But no messenger ever came. After a time, the pacing stopped. The soldiers assigned to guard him changed every few seasons. Most treated him with the indifference due any long-term prisoner. A few of the younger ones, posted far from home for the first time, occasionally tried to provoke him, asking loudly whether he still dreamed of night hunts, whether the blood ever washed off his hands. He never answered. After a while even they grew bored. To most of the garrison he became simply the old man on the hill. His health declined steadily but slowly. The thigh wound never healed cleanly. Damp weather brought swelling and pain that made him limp worse each winter. A persistent cough settled in his chest after the second monsoon season. He ate little plain millet porridge, boiled greens, occasional salted fish, and lost weight until his once fine features became sharp and hollow. The attendants noted these changes in their monthly reports to the magistrate without comment or concern. The reports were always the same: the guest remains alive, no incidents. He spoke less and less. At first he would mutter to himself, fragments of old court poems, half-remembered edicts, curses against names long forgotten. Later even that stopped. He spent most days sitting on a low wooden bench in the courtyard, wrapped in a patched quilt, watching the bamboo sway on the opposite slope or the slow drift of clouds between the peaks. Sometimes he would trace characters in the dust with a stick, names, perhaps, or dates, or simply strokes to keep his hand from stiffening completely. When the wind erased them, he did not redraw. No one knows whether remorse ever visited him. The historical record is silent on his inner life because no one bothered to ask and he never volunteered. The attendants, when questioned years later by a passing inspector, said only that he was quiet, that he never begged, never raged, never tried to bribe or escape. He simply existed, growing smaller inside his own skin until he filled almost none of it. He died sometime during the reign of Emperor Zhao, 8774 BC, most likely in the winter of 105-104 BC, when a particularly bitter cold spell settled over the valley. One of the attendants found him on the bench at dawn, quilt fallen to the ground, eyes open to the gray sky. No dramatic last words, no final confession, no plea for mercy or recognition. The body was stiff, the face calm in the way only the very old or the very empty can be. The burial was perfunctory. The soldiers dug a shallow grave behind the compound on a narrow shelf of level ground. No coffin, only a reed mat wrapped around the body. No tablet, no name, no offerings. The magistrate noted the death in his routine quarterly memorial to Han Zheng. The commoner formerly known as Liu Pengli has expired of natural causes. No disturbances. The Central Archives in Chang'an received the report, filed it, and never mentioned it again. Within a few years, the compound itself began to decay. The tiled roof collapsed in sections during heavy rains. The rammed earth wall crumbled. The attendants were reassigned or died of old age. By 90 BC, the site was abandoned. Local farmers occasionally used the remaining beams for firewood or fencing. Over decades, the terrace returned to scrub and secondary forest. By the time surveyors passed through in the early Eastern Han, nothing identifiable remained except a faint rectangular outline in the soil and a few broken roof tiles half buried under leaf mold. No marker was ever placed. No legend grew up around the spot. The valley simply absorbed him the way it absorbed everything else, quietly, indifferently, completely. The terrace where a small compound once stood has long since vanished beneath layers of pine needles, fallen bamboo, and the patient creep of ferns. Rain has washed the last crumbs of rammed earth wall into the soil. The grave, if it was ever more than a shallow scrape, has settled and flattened until no outline remains. No stone, no marker, no name carved by a grieving hand or a vengeful one. Just earth, indifferent and thorough. Farmers pass the slope sometimes on their way to higher charcoal kilns. They see nothing unusual. A child might kick over a moss-covered tile fragment without knowing what it once sheltered. The wind moves through the valley the same way it did 100 generations ago, cool in winter, heavy with mist in summer, carrying no echo of hoofbeats, no whisper of terror, no final breath of a man who once thought himself untouchable. Liu Pengli is gone in every sense the Han court intended, not merely dead but unremembered. His story did not become a famous cautionary tale recited in academies. It did not inspire epic poems or operas that tour the provinces. It did not even survive as a robust local ghost legend with annual rituals to appease his spirit. It simply dissolved, the way ink fades from cheap bamboo slips left too long in damp air. Jidong recovered without needing to mythologize its monster. The living buried their dead, replanted their fields, rebuilt their roofs, taught their children to come inside at dusk for ordinary reasons: supper, chores, bedtime stories about better things. The lanterns that once burned on mid-autumn nights to guide lost souls home eventually stopped being lit, not because the fear returned, but because it no longer needed to be remembered. Emperor Wu's verdict proved correct in its cruelty. Insignificance is a heavier sentence than the executioner's blade. To be feared is to live on in memory, to be forgotten is to cease entirely. And so the last true monument to Liu Pengli is not a stele, not a shrine, not even a whispered tale around a winter hearth. It is the ordinary quiet of a landscape that moved on. The fields still grow rice, the river still carries silt to the sea. Children still run laughing along paths at twilight. The shadow passed, the light remained. This concludes the complete narration of Liu Pengli, Prince of Jidong, one of history's earliest named predators, reduced at last to the silence he could never outrun. If this long journey through ancient darkness held your attention, please consider subscribing for more deep historical narrations, forgotten stories, and explorations of the past that still echo today. Drop a comment below. What did you think of Liu Pengli's fate? Did the slow erasure feel like true justice or something colder? And tell us, where in the world are you watching or reading from right now? City, country, time zone. Let's see how far this story has traveled. Thank you for staying until the very end.